Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Getting Started with Science Fairs webinar hosted by Youth Science Canada. My name is Kelty Murdoch. I'm a UBC engineering student, and I participated in the Canada-wide Science Fair from 2008 to 2012. I'm joined here by two other alumni, and please feel free to introduce yourselves.
My name is Emily Lenevue. I'm a biotechnologist in my first year, and I participated in science fairs in 2010, 2011, as well as 2012.
I am Farooq Salwani. I am a student here at U Moncton in Moncton, and yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. So I guess we'll just get started. Our first question is, what is a science fair?
A science fair is basically a large group of young scientists getting together and presenting their work. Basically, what we'll be concentrating on today is actually a lot of photos that you'll be seeing from the National Science Fair, so the Canada-wide Science Fair. You can see there in our PowerPoint. It's basically a lot of rows of projects. All of the projects actually look the same because everyone has the same project board at the National Fair. At the regional fair, however, you can kind of doll it up and do whatever you want, and you have your own board, whether it be cardboard or a wooden board, doesn't matter. As I said, there's a lot of young scientists. You present your work, so it's basically an experiment or a study, a lot of innovation projects as well.
I know a lot of the science fairs that I've been to and descriptions that I've heard of other science fairs say that it's sort of like a big farmer's market of science. So there's lots of stuff to look around at. There's lots of different topics, lots of different displays too, with live demos, and of course you can talk to everybody about what they've done too.
Yeah, and there are many subjects of discussions between the participants and the public, and they don't always have to do with projects. You can talk about many different things with everybody, and it's a great big discussion, in fact.
All right, so why should students get involved in science fairs?
I think a big reason to get involved in science fair is just to kind of teach yourself in a way to learn outside of a school environment and really follow your own passions, because in the school environment, yes, you do science projects and you have a lot of different opportunities in science. However, you are closely following the curriculum and whatever your teacher chooses to cover. Whereas with science fair, you can really have your own mind, have your own ideas, and apply them however you see fit. So it's a really great opportunity to become your own scientist in essence.
Another thing I really like about science fairs actually is that it makes science sort of fun. I know I'm kind of a competitive person, so as you see on the PowerPoint right now, it's a picture of some of the winners of the top projects at the National Fair. And when you participate in science fairs, there's lots of opportunity to learn, and that's great, and that's probably the most valuable part of the experience. But there's also a really fun maybe competitive, maybe not, but there's a fun application of your science as well that can reward you in other ways.
Yeah.
So, what types of science fairs are there?
There are many types of science fairs throughout, the entire world. There are many regional science fairs. Well, starting at the bottom, there's your school science fair, of course, which you've been many people know, and it's in school. Sometimes it's obligatory, depending on the teacher. But then there's the regional science fairs, which regroup your whole region. Mine was Chaleur, which was the whole northeast French-speaking part of New Brunswick. So yeah, always got to meet new people there, and these people were always from where I came from. So we had a real tight connection between those people. And then there's the National Fair, which is, just gigantic, and there's so many different types of people there. It's too bad you can't speak to all of them. It's always been something you want to do. And then there's even the international fairs, like the Google Science Fair and the Intel ICEF Science Fair. They're always, even on a larger scale than the others. And yeah, they don't even, some of them of the international fairs aren't even competitive, right? So you don't always have to look You don't always have to compete against other people. You can just make real human connections with them, and you know, yeah.
When I was in grade 12, I actually applied to go to the Taiwan International Science Fair, and I got to represent Team Canada over there, and that was an experience that I got through doing science fairs in Canada, and they asked for my experience in that application. So the doing a project in Canada, whether it's regional or national or even just your school fair, can really be a stepping stone to other places in the world and other science opportunities as well. I know we have a friend named Jasmine who did this thing called Students on Ice, which is a trip to the Antarctic, and it's a sort of like a big research cruise where they get to go down and they get to um, explore Antarctica, and they get to research the animals and they get to research the ice, and it's a great external opportunity that you get from science fairs as well. So, say you're convinced in doing a science fair, how do you find an idea?
I
You
think
can.
the
Oh,
first thing to consider when trying to find an idea is definitely just looking for something that you're interested in. Yes, in school you are doing science and you actually can find a lot of projects interesting, even if it isn't your primary passion. But by starting in a field that you really enjoy, that's really where you're going to be able to be the most efficient. Because when you enjoy something, you're going to want to work hard on it. You're going to want to go home after school, whatever it may be, even after, say, a sport practice, and really kind of balance science fair in your life, and you're going to want to do that project. So that's a really great thing about science fair. It is all your own ideas. Another thing is basically if you wanted to kind of split it up into four different categories, the first one would be observation. So it's basically just looking at everything that's around you, whether you might be walking down the street and you say, oh, like that bird looks, say, different color than that bird. Why is that? Like just something that's really, really simple and can kind of just spark ideas. Obviously, then after you can add complexity to it by reflecting on it and thinking how you can add to that. You also have to take risks. Money wise, obviously, as students, it's not really in the sense of that, you do have a budget. But what I mean by taking risks is that you don't necessarily have to have a hypothesis where you basically know what's going to happen. You kind of want to hypothesize and find something that you really don't know what's gonna happen with it, and you really don't know how what the result is going to be in the end. And then, of course, you also have to network because it's important to talk to people, even people in the field. If you go to a college or university in your area, it's a really great opportunity to network with some people, and hopefully they can help you in your process, just in the thinking process.
right, and yeah, it's always taking. You don't always have to find a brand new idea from scratch, and yeah, you can inspire yourself from other ideas, and work with that. It's always that's the whole thing about science, right? It's always innovation, not always invention. And finding a good idea is it's pretty hard when you want to win something. But don't look at it that way. In my experience, I've never really looked at an idea in a way that I wanted to win, but more what would be the most fun to do. And of course, I had said, well, the most fun to do would be curing cancer, but that's not always an option. So yeah, I went with, okay, maybe I can help diagnose cancer, and then that's what I did, right? So I wanted to do something that I could not realistically do as a normal human being. So yeah, I did something derived from that, and that's how many ideas work in the community, in the scientific community, and that really prepares you for university, college, or whatever you want to go. So yeah.
I know for sure that when I was finding an idea, my most recent idea that I worked on in science fairs was all about geothermal heating, and I had that theme for about 2.5 years in my research. And that came from being in a really cold town in the mountains and not really having very efficient, good sources of heat. And I noticed that because I was always cold. And it was something that I was saying over and over and over again. And so after kind of talking about it, I realized that I wanted to try to do something about it. And that sort of moved my research, and then eventually I came to this idea that I wanted to explore geothermal heating. So it goes back to what Emily was saying about observing and reflecting, because it was just an observation that I made, and then I took further into something I could actually try. There are other resources you can use to find ideas, though, if you're really stuck, such as this one on the slide here. It's by Google, run for the Google Science Fair, and it's called Idea Springboard.
Yeah, so
And
basically the Springboard is a search tool to help you come up with a project that you'll actually enjoy working on, because it actually splits it up into three categories. So for an example, say you love cooking, a field of science that you can think of that actually really pertains to cooking is chemistry. It's something you probably hear a lot of in your classes. And then you can actually click on the other drop-down box and decide what you want to try to do. So for here, as air quality as an example, it actually doesn't really seem to be linked to chemistry or cooking, but when you put in as the idea springboard, you can actually see that it comes up with a lot of different things, and it's kind of like a Pinterest looking feel. So you can see that there's a Wikipedia page with just the definition, and then it goes into some actual scientific literature, as well as some YouTube videos to kind of just get that spark of an idea going, not giving you any answers or even a hypothesis, but allowing you to be your own scientist and your own researcher and giving you the background info that you need.
so say you've got an idea already ready, and you kind of know sort of the area that you want to explore. How do you take that and turn it into a good idea? Like, what are some of the qualities of a really good science fair project idea?
Really, by experience, I would say a really good idea is something that is not too complex and not too simple, right? So don't go for the volcano and don't go for, curing AIDS. So stick somewhere in between that. I know it's really, 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 a big, wide thing, but don't worry about that. Go for an idea that you can realistically do, and don't be afraid to fail. I think yeah, you don't have to be extraordinary to make a good idea work. And a good idea is always something that's not only feasible but that you can relate to. So for example, like Kelsey said, her project was all about her being cold. So she can relate to that. And I've always had a passion for cancer and beating it. So I've always wanted to do that. So I incorporated it into my project. So yeah, have a passion for it, basically.
I think another important thing about ideas, especially with a science fair project, it kind of comes from being able to do it and to complete it. And what I mean to say is ideas do need to be quantifiable. So what that means is that if you want to test something, you need to be able to take a result from that. And so like you can't just have a project with some vague idea that can't really produce a result. You need to actually test something and be able to measure your results. And that is one part of a really, really good science fair idea, is something that will show you data and will show you results. I'm just being told now that if anybody's having trouble asking any questions, or if you are watching this later and you would like to ask us questions, please feel free to tweet at Youth Science Canada or using the hashtag CWSF. So that's hashtag CWSF, and we will answer your questions from there. Also, I'm sure you can comment on this video as well as once it's posted on YouTube. So once you've got your idea and you've decided it's a good idea, where do you actually find the resources to take that idea and turn it into a project?
I think one really important thing about resources is when we kind of think about them, we think of material objects. So we'll think of going to the library, looking something up, or of course being in the technological world that we are in. Obviously, maybe it might not be the library, but it might be an online research. It's definitely a go-to that a lot of high school students and even university and college students consider. But one thing that I kind of consider to be a resource in the kind of nonchalant way is a person. Like, yes, it's not actually a resource, but it kind of is in the way that you should probably go talk to people first that are in the field field to kind of get a good idea. And they'll also be really excited to help you. Like a lot of people that are even like doctors and people with their PhD writing their thesis, or even older university students will actually be really excited to kind of help you, even if it's just going through the basics to kind of upgrade you to a sort of expert on your own terms. That's actually a really great way to get the background information that you need and then go forward with that for your actual research.
I agree. I think people are a very good resource. I think for me personally, I like to read, but I don't like to read for hours and hours and hours. And so to me, it's way easier to ask a professional a single question and get the answer right away than to look it up in libraries. And so those personal connections at universities or with professionals in the industry, or even maybe with people that you know or related to who work in science, if they can answer your questions, then that's an excellent resource. I really think it's a good one to exploit as well.
Yeah, definitely people are some of the best resources you can get. I remember one time I had some difficulty programming for my project, and programming hasn't always been my forte. So what I did was I asked somebody I met at the CWSF, and this is no joke. I really asked him, how do I write this code in this language? And he just went on to explain something to me, and and that shows you that not only you can get people like grads and professors, but even people that you meet in other science fairs, since you're all a big community now. And yeah, there's always the classic where it's you go at the computer and you research on the internet for hours and hours, and you go to the library and you research for hours and hours. But, that's not always a possibility because time is limited sometimes. So yeah, people are always one of the best resources you can get.
So I just had a question come in. It says, what happens if you are doing your research and you get stuck? Have you guys ever gotten stuck or anything?
I have a
I definitely think that I've gotten stuck before, and it's something that happens to a lot of people, whether you're a scientist, a writer, like really in any field and as in any job. So I think it's just important, first of all, just to take a couple of days, maybe even a week away from the research and just kind of, regroup, not even thinking about it really in any way. And then going back to what we said, actually going to a person to talk to about it. And that person might actually be like, oh, hey, yeah, when I was, say, that age and I was doing a project, I had the same blockage and I found this was easy, or I found this helped me. So really just taking that time off to think about other things, and then don't be afraid to go to someone, even if it's just a parent or a teacher, for help.
Yeah, definitely take your head off of it for some time, and always keep up with the new stuff. I would say, like if it's about engineering, always keep up with the latest news in engineering, so you don't so maybe you can get new ideas, even if it doesn't have anything to do with your project. Always keep up reading on the latest sciences, and it can always crowdsource sometimes from asking other people questions. So yeah, that works.
A second question that we got was, do I need a mentor, and how can I find one if I need one?
I definitely don't think you need a mentor. Like I actually gave this example the other day. I did three science fairs at the national level, and actually the year that I didn't have a mentor was the year that I was the most successful. Like I'm not saying that to negate mentors or to say they're positive. Like either way, it doesn't. I'm not saying that it's a bad option, but I'm just saying that from personal experience and as from a lot of other people's experience, you definitely don't need a mentor. Sure, it is great to kind of have that backbone to rely on, but you can always just talk to a teacher as well. It really depends on also the scale of your project. If you consider yourself to be fairly familiar with the field you're working in, you might not want to consider a mentor, but if you are giving yourself kind of an extra challenge in a field you really enjoy, but not necessarily one that you excel in, then you can definitely maybe consider getting a mentor just to kind of give you that backbone and give you some background research to start on and to ask any of your questions.
Yeah, I just want to say, if this is your first science fair or maybe your second science fair and you're still relatively new to the whole process, it's not at all required of you to have a mentor. I mean, it's never required of you to have a mentor, but especially if you're just getting started, nobody's going to expect you to have contacted NASA for your rocket science work. Nobody's expecting you to go wildly beyond your reach at all. So I wouldn't let not having a mentor discourage you in any way. I think great science can absolutely be done by yourself, and I know tons of excellent alumni, some with us here today and some elsewhere, who have absolutely performed great science on their own without a mentor. So I don't think it's required, and I don't think you're at a disadvantage at all if you don't have one.
Yeah, like you said, I've never had a mentor, and I've always performed great. Uh, but if you want to have a mentor, it's always something good to have a shoulder to rely on. But remember that this is your project too, right? So the best thing you can do is learn as much as you can on your own, even if you have a mentor. I mean, if you know as much as you can on your subject, it's always helpful during the presentation and during the work process as well. So don't worry about getting or not getting a mentor, except if your project is really out of your reach. So, but even then, might consider other ideas that aren't as crazy as what you're trying to do. But there's a fine line between crazy and science. So don't worry.
That being said, two more points on mentorship. If you are interested in finding one, if you do want to try to connect with a mentor, I would say a really good place to start looking for one is either by contacting the universities or even contacting businesses in the industry. So like when I had a mentor and I was working in heating, I contacted an engineer who worked for a plumbing and heating company. So he was familiar with a lot of the building codes, and he was familiar with how systems were installed. So he's really helpful in that way. That being said, a mentor won't be able to help you through every step of the way. It's almost guaranteed. I mean, unless they were a science fair expert themselves. There are a lot of steps in the scientific process, and especially at the science fair itself, that they likely won't be able to help you with. So there will always be extra work required of you, even if you do have a mentor. All right. So when you're starting a project, I know if you have your idea, it's sort of a cycle. I know working on a science fair project, you get the chance to imagine an idea, and then you get to plan it out and improve it and create it, and then ask another question, and it's this never-ending circle of research, and it's really, really fun. So with that in mind, my question is, where do you start a project, a science fair project?
You really can start from a general idea. That's all what I always done. So, for example, I had a project where I wanted to research, if you could identify people by their hair samples. So what I did was, I watched a James Bond movie, so I wanted to get that. And then what I did was look that up. So what I did was a lot of research. So not even sometimes on the exact subject. So that means you don't always have you just in the general vicinity of what you want to look for. So always do like wide research in the beginning, and as you get closer to what you want to do, then you can start to focus. So yeah, so you start with a purpose, right? As the graph shows. So that's your general idea, what you sort of want to do. Then you research, you focus your research more and more, and you find a hypothesis. And it doesn't always have to be a big hypothesis. Sometimes it's even non-existent, but it's still there. So you really need it sometimes. Then you go on to the experimenting part. So in my case, it would be trying to analyze the hair. And one of the things I say that's the most important about everything, about all of this, is the analysis. So that's where you get your data and you look at it and you draw, general conclusions off it, general, ideas for your project. So from the analysis, you get to the conclusion. So the more data you have, the better it is, obviously. So yeah, like Kelsey said earlier, always try to get a project with more data, the best data that provides you the most data. So yeah.
And as you
Uh,
consider, it kind of looks like a flow chart in the sense that it's purpose, then research, then hypothesis, and so on and so forth. But sometimes, for example, let's say nothing comes out of your first experiment, you just kind of consider it as a trial. You definitely still document it because it's a great part of science. But don't be afraid to not really consider it as a flow chart in the sense that these arrows, yes, they're pointing in one direction, but kind of consider them as both directions. You go to your research, you go to your hypothesis, then your experiment, but don't be afraid to be like, oh, hey, I don't really know what happened, or if these results even show me anything, let's go back to the research and then kind of conduct another trial. Just like even once you've written your conclusion, you could go back into your analysis and then even your experiment in your lab book and be like, hey, I didn't realize that these numbers all kind of create, I would say, a normal curve, and then kind of do analysis on that. You can always go back for your research, you can always go back into analysis, even when you're done your project, and judges will actually even appreciate that, seeing that you're kind of going that one step further by actually taking it back a notch and re-going through the steps.
yeah, if you're looking at this graphic right now, I agree that the arrows do go in one way, but it's by no means a straight road. However, these sections, they're just they reference parts of what's called the scientific process, which is something that every good project should have. So it's good to keep in mind that when you are progressing through your project, you should have at least touched on every one of these boxes at some point. It's important to maybe not necessarily go through them in order, but it's good to document all of them and have them on your board, or at least know the answers. Another thing that's not on this slide particularly that you do need for science fairs is a logbook. And that's usually in part of your judging scheme when you're being judged at a fair. And that's just a place where you can keep extra data or a report or a summary or pictures that just documents sort of your experience as you were moving through your science fair project. And it just shows that this science was performed, it was valid, you took care to write everything down, you made lots of observations, and all of that contributes to a really good project. So we just got another question. What happens if you can't experiment with your science? So if you have a project that is in, for example, astronomy or oceanography or fundamental physics.
This is your chance actually to, not every project is obviously going to be an experiment because so many projects are theory-based projects. So what you do is basically you don't always have to look for data which is, that you have to find yourself, but that can be, crowdsourced. Usually my theory projects, they always use a database. That's always been something that I used. Because I could never really experiment with my project. So then what you can do is maybe derive that theory and make a hypothesis out of your theories. So this can be applied to this other thing. So yeah.
Another question coming in is what happens if you don't get anything out of your science fair project? So your findings are inconclusive.
If your findings are inconclusive, then you can definitely go back to your experiment, kind of see where you might have gone wrong. Never consider a mistake or even a failure to be something that's going to stop your science fair project and be like, oh, I have to restart, I have to find another idea. Like a failure is actually a stepping stone to actually continue your project, and it's definitely not something to consider as even a failure. Just kind of consider it as a bump in the road. I actually have a failure that's actually pretty embarrassing, but I guess I'll share it with you guys anyways. My first science fair project was a mathematics project. It was on non-transitivity. So basically, just as a kind of a brief summary to get you guys on board, basically I had three different dice. They all had different numbers on them. So they weren't 1 through 6. The first one had 2 5s and 4 1s, for example. And the second one had 2 6s and 4 2s. So basically the theory behind it is one die could always beat the other. And because it's a math project, obviously I wanted to have a lot of attempts, so I decided I would actually roll the dice 500 times originally, and then eventually became 1,000. But actually, on the second trial, I made my own dice that I had a company make for me. But I actually messed up when I sent one of the numbers. So my entire 500 rolls that took me a good week to do were completely a complete failure. They had nothing to do with my project. Yes, I still had to document them, but it was a good waste of a week of time. But it was funny, so it was just a stepping stone to my project. So don't worry about the failure, and just kind of keep going through from that. And don't be afraid to laugh at yourself because that's just a part of being a scientist.
I know I've had some definite, uh, we'll, we'll call them road bumps in my projects, and I always found that when I was discussing it with other students or other judges or parents, if I mentioned those road bumps and then the steps that I took to overcome them, they would all laugh and just kind of they would say, "Wow, it's so impressive that you just managed to keep going and you like good for you." And I think from those sort of difficulties, I think a lot of extra skills are built, and that's definitely one of the benefits of doing a science fair project is that you learn to carry out your research and you do learn to just keep going even if things look a little bit scary.
Yeah, definitely one of the biggest things that science fairs taught me is how to cope with stress. So remember that project I told you about identifying hairs? That was a complete and utter failure, right? So what I did was actually I spent so much time just working on it and always analyzing the hairs and at the end when I compiled all the data it said you know basically what I read was it meant absolutely nothing and then I thought maybe I did something wrong, right? So I came back on that, and what I did was I found another way to do it. So, and that way didn't work either. So that's another bump, and 3 or 4 times it was like that. So it definitely gets depressing after a while that you can't get, an answer. But at the fifth or sixth time, I think, I found a tiny, tiny correlation between the hairs and the identity of the person. So I exploited that. You can't believe. I made this huge deal about it. Oh yes, there is, and yeah. At the very, very end, I always, have a percentage of success in my projects usually, depending on the project obviously, but usually I do. So yeah, I had that, and that only time it said 60% rate of success, which is over 50, but still not that good. And I used that to say, well, if you use it multiple times, it may work. So yeah, I didn't win gold that year, of course, but I still, I still got to a very high level. So yeah, don't worry about something failing. Always try to view the, how do you say, the silver lining of the cloud. So yeah,
Another thing I think is worth mentioning about these failures, so to speak, I don't, I'm so reluctant to call them failures, even though sometimes it kind of feels like that. Um, But okay, if you're doing a science fair project and you find that your hypothesis was completely wrong and your data doesn't show at all what you thought it would, and everything just seems like everything is going wrong, that's still, if you are careful in choosing your controls and choosing your variables, and you did your experiment diligently, those results are still really valid. And instead of saying, oh, this experiment will work, you can now say, okay, I can now prove that this experiment will not work. Or I can say with some certainty that this experiment will not work. and it's still a valid conclusion from a scientific point of view. And you're still finding something, even if it wasn't what you initially had hoped for or initially had thought you were going to find. It's still definitely saying something that is just as important as its opposite statement. So I wouldn't worry about trying to prove your hypothesis, and I wouldn't worry about trying to maybe, might be tempting to lie about your hypothesis or lie about your experiment to try to fix your hypothesis. Don't do any of that. Just know that your experiment is still valid, and your conclusions are still valid if you do your experiment well.
Yeah, usually, even through all of that, I've always had a love for science and the subject. So it was always really, even though it failed most of the time, it was always really fun to fail. I know it sounds sort of weird, but you get that, that sort of small, high of, you're getting somewhere, but you're not, so you still have to find another way to get there. And that's always the most fun part for me, right? So finding a solution to a problem is always something that I love to do, and that's something I hope to do in my career in the future. So that's why, science fairs have always been, very, very, very fun for me. Because even when I failed, which was, 90% of the time, it was really, awesome to do that.
And going back to what Kelty said about not worrying about having a hypothesis that you're not actually confirming, another thing to not really worry about is say you hypothesize based on one particular variable, or say it's a physical property that you want to show. And then you actually go through it. Say you're working in chemistry, and you actually see something that's quantifiable instead of a quality that you're looking for. You might actually prove something completely different from what your original hypothesis had stated, but it's still completely valid, and you can actually again go back to the hypothesis and be like, oh well, this didn't work, but I can actually start on this in a completely new different field or a completely different idea. And a lot of science is actually created by that. It's actually just something that you thought of, and then you actually derive something else off of it.
Some of the best science is accidental.
Definitely.
So we had another question come in. The question was, what do I do if I don't have access to a big university in my city?
I think one thing to consider is that, as we said before, or like a resource can be a person. Talking to people is really important in networking. But talking to someone doesn't necessarily mean a face-to-face conversation. Especially in our generation, a lot of times you're maybe not even calling your friends, not calling your family, you're just texting them or sending kind of like a family email or something like that. But when you think about it, that kind of also pertains to science. You don't necessarily have to meet with the professor. Sure, it's great if you might be able to commute once or twice during that year to see someone, but even if you can just kind of email back and forth with them, or even with Skype, like we're doing right now, we all live in different provinces, but we're all Skyping right now, all four of us, as well as all of you guys are probably watching are probably from different provinces as well. So it's definitely not an issue, especially with the technology we have now. So whether it be email, Skype, Google Hangouts, really any tool that you can find, it's always really easy to communicate people, even if it isn't face-to-face.
Yeah, definitely. And well, from what I've learned, coming from from a place of science, it's most projects, most university serious projects from grad level and over have some of them, the workers on it have never met. They're from entire different countries. As a good friend once said, there ain't no such thing as borders, baby. So yeah, so.
Yeah, I think actually that question, it feels almost tailored to me because I grew up in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, and the closest university for me was in Calgary, which was 3.5 hours away if you drive fast, which we always did, but um, it was quite a drive away, and it wasn't really feasible for me to be going to the University of Calgary all the time for research. Um, so what that did though was it kind of forced me to look at the changes that I could make within my community. And so, like I said, I did a lot of heating, and what that forced me to do was talk to the engineers in my town and talk to homeowners in my town and builders in my town and really utilize the unique resources to my town in my science. And I think from that, you come up with something that nobody else has ever done before because maybe not a lot of scientists do live in your town. So you come up with a really unique spin on your own science. And I think it could be seen as a disadvantage, but for me, it was definitely an advantage. And I wouldn't have it any other way, really. So our next slide is a little graphic on what a science fair project looks like. And so those sections that we were speaking about on the previous slide, this is sort of just an idea of how you could put it on a poster board. If you think back to that picture we had at the beginning of the presentation of the farmers market of science fairs, this is similar to what a lot of the boards would look like. And this is where you would put a lot of your information down. Do you guys have any tips for maybe what makes a good board?
I think one of the biggest things when you're making your board, one of the biggest issues that I actually see at the regional fair as well as the national fair, that definitely is something not to do, would be to write too small. So just to oppose that, definitely have a lot of graphics, pictures, as well as make sure that all of your 5-page project report isn't on your board. Take the key factors, even if it's bullet points for some of them, even if it's just big sentences, put it on your board because you're in front of your board and you're presenting. So really the judge is going to listen to you more than the judge is actually going to read your project. They might actually do that when you're not in front of your board just to kind of re-go over it, but they've also read your project report. So they have a good idea about what you're going to talk about. So you're really just there to add stuff and add your own anecdotes, add stuff that actually happened and not necessarily is in your project report, but kind of tell them about stories, tell them what went wrong, just have a conversation with them, whereas the board is really just the most important information.
Right, definitely don't get stuck on the board. So what that means is, don't always, fret about, what's on the board or maybe what you forgot about saying that's on the board. What's really important is what you say about the project. So whatever you put the focus on when you're speaking is what's important. So no matter what your board says, it doesn't really matter as much since it's mostly for people who you can't explain your project to see. So if you're away from your project, someone can read it. But if you're there, make sure that the real project is coming from you, not from your board. So yeah, and don't also worry about what it looks like. My boards were usually terrible things to look at. Oh my God! I remember in grade 8, it was at the Manitoba Science Fair, and my board was terrible board, and the header fell on a judge's head, and it was made of wood. So I remember what I did. I think I cut the header before it actually hit him really hard. So yeah, basically I saved the judge's life. So I hope he gave me extra points. But yeah, mine were always sort of terrible. So don't worry about what they look like, and more about what you're doing, what you're saying. So yeah.
Is that why the boards aren't made of wood anymore? Are
Exactly
you the
why.
reason?
Exactly why they aren't made of wood.
Something about a fire hazard too. I'm not really sure, but yeah, I always noticed that when I was making my boards, um, it was the most fun part to me. It sounds a little funny because I mean I always had a lot of fun with the science, but when you put together your board, you get to see it all come together, and you get to really highlight the really cool things that you did. And it's almost like a trophy case of your research where you get to show off the coolest points and the most important points, and you get to put it all in one place for people to look at, and it was always so much fun for me to do. So we had another question. We're getting lots of questions. It's awesome. Um, it is what do you do if you want to do a project that is not based off a subject taught in school?
Usually, from where I'm from, especially when I was younger in grade, 7, 8, 9, and 10 maybe. Most of my projects, they weren't taught at all in school. I did a project about genetics, Alzheimer's, and while I was doing soccer practice. So there really never was anything I did that was taught in school, and that's the great thing about it actually, because it actually taught me things that I use today. So I learned so much from genetics projects in grade 8 that I still do today, and I still know things that I haven't been taught today in college and university. Um, I'm expecting that actually, next week's lecture, which is crazy. But yeah, so don't worry about what you've been taught already, because all the teaching you need is coming from yourself, from your mentor, from your resources. All the teaching you can do yourself. That's what I say. And don't worry about what anybody else thinks, because it's your project and it's your data and it's everything is about you and your project. So yeah.
Part of the really cool parts about science fair is that it's a chance to learn outside of class. So maybe you're sitting in science class one day and you're learning about the parts of a cell, which I know for tons of my friends was great, but I've never been very good at biology. So for me, it was a little bit slow, and I was kind of, always thinking about maybe the more physical sciences. And that was my opportunity when I was doing science fairs to explore the things that I wasn't getting in class at that time. And so I ended up, doing all sorts of constructive things that are just as good as what you learn in school, but it was an opportunity for me to take what I was really interested in and my passion and really apply it outside of the classroom.
And that also kind of just goes back to what we said about research. Like, even if it's not something that's taught in school, you can definitely research it on your own. And that also means that you might be actually trying even harder to complete your project because you're actually completely doing it on your own accord, actually learning it all by yourself. Another thing is I actually went to a French school, so there was a lot of classes that weren't offered necessarily at my school. But there are a lot of online resources where you can actually take classes for free, or within your school you could ask to take an online class and kind of learn. So for example, for astronomy, it might not be offered in all high schools, but you could take that as an online class. Or for myself, I took a rock science class, which actually didn't have anything to do with my science fair project. But let's say if I was doing a project in that field, that would have been a great class for me to take. So that's something you can actually consider talking to your guidance counselor about, or even looking for a free class resource online.
All right, we got another question. It looks like a good one. What's the coolest science fair project you've ever seen?
Ooh, tough one.
Definitely my project. No, I'm kidding.
Definitely project. Let's be real.
Definitely my project, right, guys? Right.
Actually, no. The coolest project I have ever seen, and it's no dispute. It was actually my school fair. I think it won second place after me. So it was a s'mores maker.
What?
It was a s'mores machine that made s'mores. So yeah, that guy eventually became my best friend, and so
Yeah, I bet.
s'mores. So
I think for me, the coolest project I ever saw was a friend of mine who went on to do very, very well. But she developed a treatment for malaria using mustard seeds. And that just blew my mind. Like I said, I'm not very biologically inclined. And so when people are really, really good at that stuff, it just looks like magic or something out of a movie to me. It honestly looks amazing. But she had the passion and the drive there, and she took it on herself to just read about it and look into it and try the science fair project, and she came out successful. And I mean, it's really, really cool, the kinds of things you get to see at science fairs for sure.
I think for me it was back when I was in grade 8. I had the pleasure of being beside one of my friends today, a girl named Maya, who was 13 at the time, I think, and she actually did some research on cardiac and gastrointestinal safety from Alzheimer drugs. So she actually reused a drug that currently existed for a completely different application. And I think the what probably inspired me was the most was I'm pretty sure her project board was like 3 times as tall as I am, and I'm like 6 feet tall. Okay, that's probably exaggerating, but still, but she's literally like 4 feet 11, let's say. So like it was like this little like 13-year-old girl like talking about Alzheimer's and all these drugs and like just amazing things that I was just so like, wow, like you're amazing. Like I just feel like there are so many great minds. It's not even the project. It's just seeing how like so many young kids can actually develop such amazing ideas that sure like they might actually not know all that they're talking like they know their field but they might not know all of the information, but what they do know is just it's just amazing.
And that being said, when you do a science fair project, if you do your research right, you get to look like a genius, even if you don't feel like one, maybe. I know I always felt like, I swear, walking into the science fair halls, I felt like the stupidest person in the room. Because there was me just putting pipes in the ground and trying to get some heat out of it, where everybody else was researching these crazy things. But the thing is, once you are really interested in a topic, your interest makes you the expert of that topic. And so you don't have to be exceptional or unbelievably intelligent, Einstein level, to do science fairs. You just have to have the interest. Another project I really wanted to mention, which I found really cool that I just thought of, was a black ice detector on a car, and my friend worked on it, and it was just a little thing that sat at the front of your car, just tiny, tiny little sensor, and it would take a picture, like a heat picture of the road in front of you, and if there was anything on the road that was in between a certain temperature range, it would set a little alarm off, a little warning saying, "Oh, this area is potentially covered in black ice. Be careful." And I thought that was amazing because we have so many accidents involving black ice, but it's such a simple solution that, I mean, it's something that's really applicable to real life. So I thought that was really cool. So anyway, I guess if we have no more questions coming in, then that's all I have, unless you two have any more questions for me.
Covers everything.
I'll check. I'll just check our other chat lines. Don't forget, if you didn't get a chance to ask questions now, you can always tweet using the hashtag CWSF. It will get to your questions as well. And this video will be posted live on YouTube. If you want to follow up on anything, please do. We'll read them. We'll answer them. We'll make sure we get your questions answered. That's what we're here for. So anyway, I guess if there are no more questions, then that's all I have for today. Thank you everybody for coming out. I hope you all go on to think about what you could do at a science fair, and I hope that you all have excellent experiences with your first science fair, and just like we all did. And good luck.